The first light in Dry Creek did not so much arrive as it seeped into the world. A thin, gray wash that turned the black shapes of the saguaros into sentinels and the distant mesas into sleeping giants. Dust, fine as flour, lay over everything, a pale blanket tucked in by the wind that blew without cease. By the time the sun bled a fierce orange along the horizon, Harlan McGrath was already in the saddle, his large frame a familiar silhouette against the dawn. The air smelled of mesquite and cool earth, the promise of another hot, uncompromising day. He rode the fence line, his eyes scanning the wire, the posts, the vast, open country that was his life. The ranch was a sprawling thing, earned not by luck but by 2 decades of sweat and a silence that most folks mistook for slowness. They had called him Bear McGrath since he was a boy, a name born of his size and his quiet way. He did not mind it. Bears were steady. They knew their own ground. And right now, his ground felt shaky. Word had come down with the new telegraph line that the railroad men were sniffing around again, their offers sweet as molasses and just as sticky. Harlan had no intention of selling the land his father had bled for, nor the dignity of the men who worked it. His morning survey done, he guided his horse toward the cookhouse, a sturdy clapboard building that was the ranch's heart. Smoke curled from its stone chimney, a signal that Delilah Rose Whitlock was at her post. He had hired her 6 months ago, after his last cook, a cranky old man named Silas, had finally surrendered to his rheumatiz. Delilah had arrived in Dry Creek with little more than a trunk and a story of a wagon accident that had claimed her family on the trail west. She was a woman built for this country, solid and capable, with a strength in her broad shoulders that spoke of resilience. She was also as guarded as a locked chest. Harlan swung down from his horse, the leather of his saddle groaning in protest. He entered the kitchen, his head nearly brushing the doorframe. The room was warm, filled with the comforting scents of brewing coffee and frying bacon. Delilah stood at the big cast-iron stove, her back to him. "Good morning," he said, his voice a low rumble. She turned, but not all the way. "Morning, Mr. McGrath. The coffee is ready." Her eyes, a deep shade of prairie grass after a rain, flickered toward him and then away, fixing on a spot just past his shoulder. It was her habit. She rarely met anyone's gaze for more than a second. But this morning was different. This morning, a faint, mottled redness bloomed high on her left cheek, a smudge of angry color just below her eye. It was not a rash from the heat. Harlan had seen marks like that before, on spooked horses and on men after a saloon brawl. It was the ghost of a handprint. A knot tightened in his gut. He said nothing of it. To speak of it would be to shame her. And her pride was a palpable thing, as vital to her as the air she breathed. He poured a mug of coffee from the pot, the liquid thick and black. He watched as she moved, her motions efficient but stiff. There was a tension in her neck, a slight tremor in her hands as she plated up breakfast for the ranch hands who would soon come stomping in. He took a sip of the coffee. It was strong enough to peel paint, just the way he liked it. "Thank you, Delilah." He turned to leave, pausing at the door. He respected her silence, but the sight of that mark left a bitter taste in his mouth, worse than alkali dust. The ranch hands ambled in a few minutes later, bringing the scent of horses and sweat with them. They were a rough but decent lot, and they had taken to Delilah's cooking like starving coyotes. Jeb, a lanky cowboy with a face like a road map, took a swig of his coffee and let out a theatrical gasp. "Good heavens! Delilah, this brew is as thick as road tar. A man could stand a spoon straight up in it." Delilah, still turned toward the stove, answered without missing a beat, her voice as dry as a creek bed in August. "Drink up. You will work twice as hard today, and that will save me on rations come supper time." A ripple of laughter went through the men. The tension Harlan had felt seemed to lift, chased away by the familiar morning ritual. He watched from the doorway. the corner of his own mouth twitching. She had a wit as sharp as her butcher knife when she chose to use it. Later that day, Harlan rode into Dry Creek for supplies. The town was little more than a dusty street lined with a general store, a blacksmith, a church, and Zeke Hollander's saloon, the Thirsty Gulch. It was the saloon that served as the town's real center, the place where opinions were forged and reputations were broken. As Harlan tied his horse to the hitching post outside the general store, he saw Sheriff Ransom Pike leaning against a porch column of the saloon, polishing his badge with his thumb. The sheriff was a man who valued order above all else, which often meant he let trouble alone as long as it stayed quiet. "Harlan," the sheriff said, nodding a greeting. "Sheriff." From inside the saloon, Harlan could hear Zeke Hollander's oily voice, carrying on the still air. "He is a big man, our Bear McGrath. Big heart, too, taking in strays, giving them work. Even that stout cook of his. A man has to be charitable in these hard times." The words were buttered, but the meaning underneath was sharp. Harlan's hands tightened on his reins. He had heard whispers like this before, snaking out of Zeke's saloon and poisoning the town's well of decency. Zeke was in league with the railroad men. Harlan knew it. Anything to stir up trouble, to make the ranch seem unstable, to put pressure on him. And a woman alone, especially one who did not fit the delicate mold some men preferred, was an easy target. Sheriff Pike heard the words. "Two." Harlan saw it in the slight shift of the man's eyes, but the sheriff just kept polishing his badge, his face a mask of deliberate neutrality. Harlan finished his business at the store, his mind churning. He bought flour and beans, and on an impulse, a new, heavy bolt for a door. When he returned to the ranch, the sun was low, painting the sky in the shades of bruised purple and fiery orange. The hands were tending to the horses, their talk low and easy. Everything seemed normal. Yet Harlan felt a growing unease. He walked toward the cookhouse. As he approached, he saw Delilah by the woodpile, gathering logs for the stove. A bucket clattered in the distance, and she jumped, spinning around with a gasp, her hand flying to her chest. She saw him and her face hardened, the fear quickly masked by a familiar guardedness. He did not comment on her skittishness. He walked past her to the woodpile. There, pressed into the soft bark of a split log, was a clear handprint. It was large, the fingers thick. It was not his, and it was certainly not hers. His gaze then fell to the latch on the cookhouse door. He walked over and tested it. It was loose in its housing. The wood around the screws splintered, as if it had been forced. Someone had been here, prowling around her kitchen in the night. The pieces clicked into place in Harlan's mind, the loose latch, the handprint, the mark on her face, the rumors from Zeke's saloon. It was a picture he did not like, a story of mean-spirited cruelty aimed at a woman who had already lost everything. He went to his saddlebags and retrieved the new bolt he had bought. He did not ask her permission. He simply took his tools from the small shed and began to work, his large hands surprisingly deft as he removed the flimsy latch and fitted the heavy, solid bolt in its place. He worked in silence, the scrape of the screwdriver and the solid thud of the hammer the only sounds in the deepening twilight. Delilah stood on the porch of the cookhouse, a silhouette against the lamplight from within. She watched him, her arms crossed over her chest. She said nothing, but as he finished, as he slid the thick bolt home with a satisfying metallic clack, he saw her shoulders relax. Just a fraction. It was the smallest of surrenders, a silent admission that she knew she was not safe, and that his silent act of fortification was, in its own way, an answer, an understanding. He packed up his tools and turned to go, the day's work finally done. "Mr. McGrath," she said, her voice quiet. He stopped and looked at her. For the first time all day, she met his eyes. "The coffee will be hot in the morning," she said. Harlan nodded once. "I will be here." He walked toward the main house as darkness settled over the ranch. A profound and heavy quiet. The wind picked up, whispering through the sagebrush, carrying secrets and threats. He knew this was only the beginning, the first ripple in a pond that was about to get very stormy. The hot wind came a few days later, a relentless blow from the south that carried with it the fine red dust of the plains. It was a miserable, scouring wind that made tempers short and coated everything with a gritty film. It also carried Zeke Hollander's words. Like the dust, they got into everything, settling in the corners of conversations at the general store and clouding the air at the Sunday church social. He was clever. He never attacked Harlan directly. Instead, he wrapped his insults in the guise of praise. He would hold court at the bar in the Thirsty Gulch, his voice just loud enough to carry, saying things like, "That Harlan McGrath, he is a saint. I tell you, a man of his standing, taking on a cook like that, most would turn away a woman of such substantial build. But not Harlan. His heart is as big as he is." The men listening would chuckle, and the poison would spread. The word substantial became a joke, a piece of public property. The women of the town, who had once given Delilah wary but polite nods, now looked at her with a new expression, a mixture of scorn and a cruel sort of pity. In a land where life was pared down to the bone, a person's reputation was their most valuable possession. To be a woman alone was a precarious state. To be a woman outside the accepted mold was to invite judgment. Delilah felt the shift in the air every time she went to town. She felt the eyes on her back, heard the whispers that died the moment she turned her head. So she stopped going. Harlan saw it. He saw the way she retreated further into herself, her silence becoming a fortress. He said nothing. Words were not his tools. Instead, he acted. He announced one morning that the supply runs would be on Wednesdays now, not Saturdays. He did not say it was to spare her the weekend crowds and the lingering churchgoers. He just said the schedule had changed. He spent an afternoon on the roof of the cookhouse, replacing shingles that had been loosened by the wind. His hammer blows a steady, rhythmic reassurance against the sky. He took to refilling the large water barrel outside her door every evening, saving her the heavy work of hauling buckets from the well. Delilah noticed every single thing. She saw the new shingles, felt the solid thud of the door as it closed on its tightened hinges, found the water barrel brimming each morning. These were quiet, practical kindnesses, offered without expectation of thanks. They were like water seeping into hard, cracked earth. A part of her that had been brittle for a very long time began to soften. But trust was a foreign country, and she was not ready to cross the border. She kept her distance, offering him his coffee in the morning with the same guarded civility as always, her gratitude a silent, unexpressed weight in her chest. The danger, however, did not retreat. After a particularly violent dust storm that turned the noon sky a hellish red, she went to latch her window for the night. There, in the freshly settled dust on the sill outside, was the clear impression of a man's boot heel. It was a heavy, worn-down heel, not one she recognized from the ranch hands. Her blood ran cold. Someone had stood right there, peering into her kitchen, hidden by the swirling dust. That night, sleep would not come. She lay in her small cot in the room behind the kitchen, listening to the wind moan around the eaves. Sometime after midnight, she heard it, a soft scraping sound at the door, followed by a single, deliberate knock. Her heart leaped into her throat. She slid from the bed, her feet silent on the wooden floor. The new bolt Harlan had installed was a dark, solid line against the wood. Her hand trembled as she double-checked it, making sure it was slid all the way home. Then, she took the large cleaver from the butcher block. She did not know who was on the other side of that door, but she would not be a helpless victim. She stood in the darkness, the heavy blade cold in her hand, and waited. After a long, agonizing silence, she heard the faint crunch of boots walking away. She did not move until the first gray light of dawn touched the window. the cleaver still gripped tight in her hand. The next day, Harlan found Sheriff Pike in town again, this time inside the general store, weighing a bag of coffee beans. Harlan walked up to him, his presence filling the narrow aisle. "Zeke Hollander is stirring up trouble," Harlan said, his voice low and flat. Sheriff Pike did not look up from the scale. "Zeke is a businessman. Harlan, he talks. It is what he does. He sent someone to my ranch last night, to my cookhouse." The sheriff finally looked up, his eyes weary. "Can you prove that? Did you see who it was?" "No, but I will not have my people harassed." "Look, Harlan," the sheriff said, setting the coffee bag down with a sigh, "I am going to give you some advice. Leave Zeke Hollander alone. He has his hands in everything in this town, from the bank to the freight office. You raise a hand to him, and you are not just fighting one man. You are fighting the whole town. It will get ugly, and it will be you, not him, who ends up on the wrong side of a rope or a legal notice. Do not be a fool." Harlan stood there for a long moment, the sheriff's words hanging in the air like smoke. He was being told that the law was a useless tool, that a man's honor and a woman's safety were subject to the whims of a saloon owner with powerful friends. He turned and left the store without another word, the injustice of it a cold, hard knot in his stomach. That evening, he was sitting on his porch, watching the last of the light fade from the sky, when he saw a plate on the top step. It was one of the simple tin plates from the cookhouse. On it sat 2 pieces of golden fried chicken and a thick wedge of cornbread, still warm. There was no note. There was no one in sight. Delilah was already back in the cookhouse, the light from her lamp a small, steady glow in the distance. Harlan picked up the plate. He knew what this was. It was not payment. It was not a plea. It was an acknowledgement, an offering, a treaty signed without a single word. He sat there and ate the chicken and the cornbread. It was the best meal he had ever tasted. The chicken was crisp and juicy, the cornbread sweet and tender. But it was the meaning behind it that filled him up, that eased a loneliness inside him he had not even realized he carried. The next morning, before he rode out, he walked over to the cookhouse. He did not go inside. He simply left the tin plate on the porch rail. It was empty and wiped clean. A silent ritual had begun. It was a small thing. A plate of food passed between 2 solitary people in the vast, indifferent landscape of the West. But in a world of loud threats and poisonous whispers, it was a quiet promise. And for now, it was enough. The attack came a week later, on a moonless, starless night when the darkness was so complete it felt like a heavy blanket smothering the world. The only sound was the incessant, lonely cry of the wind. Inside the cookhouse, Delilah had just finished cleaning up, the familiar scent of soap and hot water a small comfort in the vast silence. She slid the heavy bolt Harlan had installed, the sound a solid, reassuring finality to her day. She retired to her small room, but a profound unease kept sleep at bay. Outside, a figure moved through the shadows, keeping low to the ground. He was one of Zeke's men, a drifter with empty eyes and a need for coin. He carried a can of lamp oil. The plan, as Zeke had laid it out with a smirk, was simple: solve the rumor problem with ashes, a little fire by the cook's window, a scare to send the woman packing, and another crack in the foundation of Harlan McGrath's world. The man crept to the window of the kitchen and began to pour the oil, the liquid soaking dark patches into the dry, clabbered wall. He struck a match, the small flame flaring violently in the wind. He tossed it. The wall ignited with a hungry whoosh, but the prairie wind was a fickle master. At that very moment, it shifted, gusting with sudden, vicious force not against the cookhouse, but away from it. It caught the new flames and hurled them like a fiery spear across the 10 yards of open ground to the hay barn. The dry, seasoned hay inside exploded into a tower of fire. Delilah smelled the smoke first, acrid and terrifying. Then she saw the light, a hellish orange glow that filled her small window. For a heartbeat, she was frozen, the old terror of the wagon accident rising in her throat. Then, her training for survival took over. She did not scream. She ran from her room, out the back door of the cookhouse, and straight to the large iron bell Harlan had mounted on a tall post for just this purpose. She grabbed the thick rope and pulled with all her might. The deep, frantic clang of the fire bell shattered the night. Lights flickered on in the bunkhouse, and then Harlan's house. Men spilled out, shouting, their figures stark against the roaring inferno of the barn. Harlan was already moving, his voice a calm and powerful roar that cut through the panic. "Bucket Brigade, to the well, Jeb. You and Tom get the horses out of the main stable before they panic and break their legs. Move." He did not waste a second. He organized the men into 2 lines stretching from the well to the fire, their movements becoming a desperate, rhythmic machine. Buckets of water were drawn and passed, hissing into steam as they hit the edges of the blaze. Their focus was not on saving the barn. It was already a lost cause, a roaring chimney sending sparks and embers into the dark sky. Their fight was to keep it from spreading to the bunkhouse, to the main stable, to the cookhouse where Delilah now stood, refilling canteens with water for the men, her face grim in the flickering light. They worked as one, a small army fighting a relentless enemy, with Harlan at the center, a giant figure of pure resolve. They saved the other buildings, but the hay barn was a skeleton of charred timbers by the time the flames began to die down. The loss was significant. It was their entire winter feed for the cattle. It was just enough damage to make a banker nervous. And then, nature added its own cruel postscript. As the last of the flames guttered, the wind began to howl with a new, menacing pitch. The air grew thick, heavy with electricity. From the west, a solid black wall, miles high, was advancing on them, swallowing the faint starlight. "Dust storm!" Harlan bellowed, his voice raw from smoke. Everyone inside checked the stock. The world dissolved into a blinding, choking chaos of red dust and wind. Visibility dropped to nothing. The air was sandpaper against the skin, grit in the teeth. The remaining cattle, already spooked by the fire, began to bawl in terror. Harlan fought his way toward the main stable to help Jeb and Tom. Inside the relative shelter of the building, the air was still thick, the sound of the wind a physical pressure against the walls. A young hand, a boy of 17 named Billy, had been trying to calm a panicked mare when she reared, her hoof striking a lantern and sending him crashing against a stall. Harlan found him on the ground, his face pale with pain. "My ankle," he gasped. "I think it is broken." Harlan did not hesitate. He bent down and scooped the boy up into his arms as if he weighed nothing. He carried him out of the stable and into the teeth of the storm, bending his head low, his huge body a shield against the punishing wind. He navigated by pure instinct, his feet finding the path to the one place that still felt like a sanctuary, the cookhouse. He shouldered the door open and carried Billy inside, setting him gently on the long kitchen table. Delilah was there, her lamp trimmed low, its light a soft yellow beacon in the swirling madness outside. She took one look at the boy's unnaturally twisted ankle and went to work. She fetched a basin of water and clean cloths. Then, without a moment's thought, she took the hem of her sturdy apron and ripped a long, wide strip of fabric from it. She worked with a quiet, focused competence, cleaning the injury and fashioning a temporary splint with a piece of kindling and the cloth from her apron. The storm raged for nearly an hour. The men huddled in the bunkhouse, Harlan and Delilah staying with Billy in the kitchen, at the height of the gale, when it seemed the wind might tear the roof from its nails. Jeb's voice could be heard from the doorway, where he had come to check on the boy. "I swear, if I live through this, I will take a bath every week for a whole month," he yelled over the roar. Delilah, tying off the bandage on Billy's leg, did not even look up. "Good," she answered, her voice steady. "I will heat the water for you tomorrow." The small moment of dry wit, of normalcy in the face of disaster, broke the tension. A few of the men managed a weak chuckle. The next morning, the world was remade. The wind had died, leaving behind a strange, calm silence. A thick blanket of red dust covered everything, softening the sharp edges of the scorched barn and giving the landscape a mournful, alien beauty. The men were exhausted, their faces streaked with soot and grime. It was into this scene of weary devastation that a buggy appeared, rolling slowly up the ranch road. In it sat two men in city suits, Mr. Davies, the slick agent for the railroad, and Mr. Sterling, the vice president of the bank in the next county over. They climbed down, their polished shoes sinking into the dust, their faces masks of practiced concern. "McGrath," Mr. Sterling said, his voice smooth as butter. "We heard about the fire, a terrible tragedy. We came to see if we could be of assistance. We understand a loss like this can be financially crippling." "Mr." Davies added, his eyes scanning the destroyed barn. "The railroad is a friend to the settlers of this territory. The bank and we would be willing to arrange an emergency loan to help you rebuild, or perhaps to discuss a fair price for your land, to unburden you of this tragedy." Harlan looked from their sympathetic faces to the road behind them. Standing there, beside his own horse, was Zeke Hollander. He was not smiling, but there was a gleam of triumph in his eyes. He was the snake, and these two were his fangs. "The ranch is not for sale," Harlan said, his voice flat and cold, "and I do not need your help." As the buggy turned to leave, Harlan heard Mr. Davies say to the banker, his voice carrying on the still morning air, a bit too loudly to be accidental, "It is a shame. They say the fire started in the cookhouse. Something about the woman cooking a private, late-night meal for him. When you mix business with pleasure, you are bound to get burned." The lie was a fresh poison, more toxic than the smoke and more suffocating than the dust. The narrative had been twisted. It was no longer a cowardly attack. It was now a sordid tale of impropriety, a story that would be told with winks and nudges. The autumn fair was this Sunday. The whole town would be there. Harlan knew, with a certainty as heavy as stone, that the town well was about to become a stage. The autumn fair was the one day a year Dry Creek pretended it was a proper town. After the Sunday service, the dusty main street was filled with people in their best clothes. There were tables laden with prize-winning pies and jams, children chasing greased pigs, and the general hum of a community trying to forget the harshness of the land for a few hours. Delilah had not wanted to come. The thought of the stares and whispers was a physical weight. But Harlan had been quietly insistent. The hands deserved a day, he had said, and hiding was not the answer to anything. So she came, walking beside the ranch wagon, her head held high, a posture that cost her more effort than hauling a 50-pound sack of flour. She kept to herself, moving along the edges of the crowd, a solitary island in the sea of forced cheerfulness. She saw the looks, the way conversations stopped when she drew near and resumed with renewed vigor when she passed. The poison from Zeke's saloon had done its work well. She felt branded. After an hour of the suffocating pretense, the heat and the dust made her throat raw. The town well stood in the center of the square, a hub of activity. It was the last place she wanted to go, but thirst was a more immediate tyrant than shame. She waited her turn, then took the rope for the bucket. As she leaned over the stone wall of the well, a shadow fell over her. "Well, now, look what we have here," a voice oozed beside her. It was Zeke Hollander, his face flushed with saloon courage, a coterie of his usual loafers flanking him. "Drawing water for your master, or perhaps you are just trying to cool off after all that late-night cooking. I hear things can get pretty hot out at the McGrath place." Delilah ignored him. She focused on the rhythm of pulling the rope. Hand over hand, the bucket, heavy with water, cleared the lip of the well. The crowd around them had gone quiet. Sensing the brewing confrontation, they formed a silent, watching circle. "Do not be rude, woman," Zeke sneered, stepping directly in her path as she tried to lift the bucket. A decent person answers when spoken to, but I suppose decency is not something you are familiar with. Delilah's jaw was a hard line. Please let me pass, she said, her voice low and tight. Zeke laughed, a short, ugly sound. Let you pass? Why? I am just being a concerned citizen. A woman of your appetites must be a great burden on a man, even a big one like Bear McGrath. He leaned in close, his breath sour with whiskey. Tell me, he whispered, but loud enough for the first few rows of the crowd to hear. Does he pay you extra for the special services, or is the work itself the reward? Something inside Delilah snapped. The weeks of whispers, the fear in the night, the constant, grinding humiliation, it all boiled over. She straightened up, her eyes blazing with a fire Zeke had not expected. You are a vile man. Zeke Hollander. His smirk vanished, replaced by a flash of fury. His hand came up so fast no one had time to react. The slap was a sharp, cracking sound that seemed to hang in the stunned silence. Delilah's head snapped to the side, a bright red mark instantly blooming on her cheek. The water bucket slipped from her grasp, teetering on the edge of the well. And in that moment, as the giant rancher noticed the fresh, red slap marks on his fat settler cook's face, what he did next shook the town. Harlan McGrath was suddenly just there. No one saw him coming through the crowd. He simply materialized, a mountain of quiet rage, his shadow eclipsing Zeke completely. The sun was at his back, making it impossible to see his face clearly, but there was no mistaking the coiled power in his stillness. He did not shout. He did not lunge. His first act was to reach out a steady hand and secure the wobbling bucket of water, setting it safely on the ground beside Delilah so she would not lose her balance. Only then did he turn his attention to the man who had struck her. His voice, when it came, was dangerously calm. I am looking for witnesses, Harlan said, his gaze sweeping over the silent faces in the crowd. I need someone to tell Sheriff Pike what they just saw. Zeke, recovering his bravado, scoffed. There is nothing to see. McGrath, the woman was insolent. I was merely teaching her some manners. You put your hand on one of my people, Harlan said, each word as heavy and deliberate as a hammer blow. And what are you going to do about it, you big dumb ox? Zeke taunted, his hand dropping to the handle of the knife on his belt. You going to start a brawl right here in front of God and everyone? Zeke's mistake was pulling the knife. The blade flashed in the afternoon sun. The crowd gasped, but Harlan did not move back. He moved forward. As Zeke lunged, Harlan's left hand shot out and clamped around Zeke's wrist, stopping the blow cold. With his right hand, he delivered a single, precise, open-palmed strike to Zeke's elbow. There was a sickening crack as the joint hyperextended. The knife clattered to the dusty ground. Before Zeke could even cry out, Harlan twisted the captured arm, spun him around, and forced him to his knees. His face pressed into the dirt. It was over in 2 seconds. It was not a fight. It was a dismantling. Sheriff Ransom Pike finally pushed his way through the crowd. All right, Harlan, that is enough. Let him go. Harlan held Zeke pinned for a second longer, letting the entire town see the saloon boss helpless in the dust. Then he released him and stepped back. Zeke scrambled to his feet, cradling his injured arm, his face a mask of pain and murderous hatred. You will pay for this, McGrath, he snarled. I will ruin you. The sheriff stepped between them. I am taking statements, he said, his voice laced with resignation. This is now a public matter. As he spoke, a small, elderly woman, Mrs. Gable, the pastor's wife, stepped forward. Sheriff, she said, her voice thin but clear. I saw the whole thing, and what is more, I saw that man, Mr. Hollander, sneaking around the McGrath cookhouse late one night last week. I thought it was peculiar then. Now I know it was wicked. A murmur went through the crowd. It was the first crack in the wall of fear Zeke had built around the town. Harlan ignored Zeke's sputtering threats. He looked out at the faces of his neighbors, the people of Dry Creek, and for the first time in his life, he spoke his heart in a public square. "This woman," he said, his voice resonating with a deep, quiet authority, "is Delilah Whitlock. She is the cook at my ranch. She is one of my people. She belongs to the honor of my ranch. Anyone who lays a hand on her, anyone who speaks ill of her, insults every single one of us. We are done with the whispers. We are done with the threats. This stops today." He then turned to Delilah, who was standing frozen, her hand covering the mark on her face, her eyes wide with a mix of shock and something else, something she had not felt in years. He gently took her by the arm. "Come, Delilah," he said softly. "Let us go home." As they walked away, the crowd parted for them, a silent path opening in their wake. The stares that followed them now were different. The scorn was gone, replaced by a grudging, startled respect. They had come to the fair expecting to see pies and pigs. They had seen justice instead, swift and uncompromising, and it had left them breathless. That night, a cold wind blew down from the mountains. The ranch was quiet, the men speaking in hushed tones, the day's event still settling. Harlan was doing a final check of the stables when he saw it. Nailed to the heavy wooden door was a freshly lettered sign. It was a legal summons, ordering Harlan McGrath to appear before the circuit judge on the charge of disturbing the peace and assault. The paper was stark white under the rising moon, a formal declaration that Zeke Hollander's war had just moved to a new battlefield. The legal summons on the stable door was a different kind of weapon from Zeke's knife. It was cold, official, and in this part of the country, often more dangerous. Zeke Hollander wasted no time pressing his advantage. He was seen in close conversation with Mr. Sterling from the bank and Mr. Davies, the railroad agent. They would sit on the porch of the saloon, their heads together, their quiet laughter carrying on the wind like the buzz of blowflies. Word filtered back to the ranch that the circuit judge, a man named Miller, known more for his love of fine whiskey than for his grasp of the law, was due in Dry Creek a week earlier than scheduled. The legal trap was being set. The charge was assault and disturbing the peace. But the true goal was the ranch itself. A guilty verdict would come with a fine so heavy, Harlan would have no choice but to mortgage his land to the very men who had engineered his conviction. Delilah watched Harlan absorb this news. He grew quieter, if that were possible. A deep stillness settling over him that was not calm, but the heavy silence of a gathering storm. She saw the weight on his shoulders and felt a hot, unfamiliar anger. She had spent years of her life enduring, absorbing blows both literal and figurative, and surviving through quiet retreat. But Harlan had stood for her. He had shielded her with his own body and defended her with his own honor. She could not stand by and watch Zeke's network of whispers and corrupted favors tear him down. Action was called for, a different kind of action. She thought of the women in town, the ones who worked for men like Zeke. She thought of Sarah, a young waitress at the Thirsty Gulch, a girl with tired eyes who had always been kind to her on those early supply runs, sharing a quiet word or a small smile when no one was looking. One afternoon, Delilah baked a small apple tart, wrapped it in a clean cloth, and walked the long, dusty miles into town. She found Sarah sweeping the saloon porch, her movements weary. Delilah offered her the tart. Sarah's eyes widened, first in suspicion, then in a kind of wondering gratitude. "No one has ever brought me something like this," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. "You have always been decent to me." Delilah replied simply, "I have a question for you. Zeke Hollander. He keeps records." "Yes, for his liquor deliveries." Sarah's face clouded over. "He keeps books for everything. He trusts no one. He writes it all down in a big leather ledger he keeps in the back storeroom." "Why?" "He is trying to ruin Mr. McGrath. I think the proof of how he does it might be in that book." Sarah looked over her shoulder, toward the dark interior of the saloon. "He would fire me. Or worse." I know. I am not asking you to risk yourself. Just, if there was ever a time when he was gone, and the storeroom was unlocked, that is all I need. A few minutes. 2 days later, a boy from town rode out to the ranch with a message. A rancher 2 towns over was selling a prize bull, and Zeke Hollander, who fancied himself a cattleman, had gone with Mr. Davies to see it. He would be gone until late. The message was unsigned. That evening, as twilight bled into night, Delilah slipped away from the ranch. She approached the town from the back, moving through the alleyways like a ghost. The back door to the saloon storeroom was, as promised, unlocked. The room smelled of sour beer and sawdust. In the faint light from the grimy window, she saw it, a thick, grease-stained ledger on a high shelf. Her heart hammered against her ribs as she took it down. She lit a small match, its flare dangerously bright, and scanned the pages. It was mostly numbers and dates, but then she found what she was looking for. In the margins, next to shipments of whiskey and beer, were Zeke's spidery, handwritten notes. Beside a large delivery to the county seat, he had written sweetener for Judge M. Next to a note about a land survey. Grease for the railroad. It was all there, a meticulous record of his corruption. She tore the 2 most incriminating pages from the book, tucked them into her dress, and slipped back into the night. Sheriff Ransom Pike found Harlan mending a fence the next day. The lawman looked more tired than usual. "The judge will be here Friday. Harlan, it does not look good. Zeke has the whole town council ready to testify about how you disrupted the peace of the fair." "He was going to hurt her," Harlan said, his voice a low rumble as he pulled the wire taut. "I know what I saw, but what I saw and what the law says are 2 different things these days." Pike kicked at a stone with the toe of his boot. "I am a man who likes order. McGrath, I do not like chaos, and I do not like seeing a good man railroaded. But my hands are tied, unless—" Harlan stopped his work and looked at him. "Unless what?" "Unless you have something solid, something that can turn this whole table over. If you have proof that Zeke Hollander is a bigger threat to this town's order than you are, you bring it to me, and I will do my job." That night, Harlan stood in front of the small, cracked mirror in his room. He saw the face the world saw a big man, slow to speak, quick to anger. He remembered the fights of his youth, the way the other boys would taunt him, knowing he would eventually lash out, confirming their opinion of him as nothing more than a brute. He had always lost those fights, even when he had won, because he had always been left with the shame of their laughter. He feared that shame more than any jail cell. But this was different. This was not about his own pride. It was about Delilah's safety. It was about his ranch. It was about the truth. He looked at his own reflection and practiced the words, his voice quiet in the small room. He struck her. She was under my protection. I acted to defend her. He kept the sentences short, hard, and true. He would not be a spectacle. He would be a witness. He would stand in the light. Later, he was sitting at his kitchen table, cleaning a rifle, when Delilah came in. She was holding one of his work shirts and a needle and thread. "There was a tear," she said, avoiding his eyes. "I thought I would mend it for the trial." She sat in the chair opposite him, the light from the oil lamp casting a warm glow on her focused face. He watched her hands as she worked. They were strong, capable hands, but he could see a slight tremor in them. She was still afraid. They both were. He wanted to say something, to thank her, to tell her that her quiet courage gave him strength, but the words were unfamiliar territory. Instead, he watched her needle move in and out of the thick fabric with practiced ease. "Your needle is sharper than Zeke's knife," he said, the words coming out before he had a chance to think about them. She stopped sewing. Her head came up, and she looked at him, really looked at him. A small smile touched her lips. And then, a sound he had never heard before escaped her. It was a laugh. Not a big, loud laugh, but a soft, genuine sound of amusement that lit up her entire face and made her eyes sparkle. It was like watching the sun break through after a week of storms. The moment was shattered by the arrival of Jeb, his face pale and his breathing ragged. "Boss, you better come. It is Mrs. Gable." They found the pastor's wife being helped to her feet just outside the church doors by Father Michael. Two rough-looking men, strangers to Dry Creek, were disappearing down the street. Her basket of knitting was overturned, the yarn scattered in the dust. "They pushed me," she said, her voice shaky but indignant. "They told me it would be best for my health if I forgot what I saw at the fair." Father Michael's face was thunderous. "This is an outrage, to threaten an old woman on the steps of a church. This is the work of a coward. Harlan, this is the work of Zeke Hollander. The entire town will hear of this." Harlan looked at the scattered yarn in the dust, at the frightened but resolute face of the old woman, and at Delilah, who had placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. The fear he had felt in front of the mirror was gone, burned away by a cold, clarifying rage. Zeke had overplayed his hand. He had tried to silence the women of Dry Creek. He would soon find out that he had only given them all a reason to speak. The day before the trial, the sky turned a strange, bruised yellow. The air grew heavy and still, the usual wind dying down to an unnerving silence. Birds stopped singing. The cattle in the fields grew restless, lowing uneasily at the ominous clouds gathering over the distant mountains. It was an unnatural calm, the deep breath a predator takes before it strikes. The rain began without warning, not a gentle patter, but a sudden, violent deluge, as if the sky itself had ruptured. Huge, heavy drops hammered the dusty ground, turning it to mud in seconds. The Dry Creek bed, a dusty snake for most of the year, began to trickle, then to flow, then to roar. A wall of churning brown water, thick with uprooted sagebrush and debris, descended from the mountains. Dry Creek was no longer dry. It was a raging, hungry river. The town was thrown into chaos. The torrent overflowed its banks. Clawing at the foundations of the buildings along the main street, water poured into the general store, into the blacksmith's shop. The small wooden bridge that connected the two halves of the town shuddered and groaned, its support posts battered by the relentless current. People scrambled for higher ground, their shouts of alarm nearly lost in the thunder of the flood. In the midst of the panic, a clear, calm voice cut through the noise. It was Delilah. She stood on the slightly elevated ground near the town well, the very stage of her humiliation, now the center of the crisis. Water was already bubbling up from the well itself, its stone circle an island in the rising tide. "Bucket lines," she commanded, her voice carrying an authority that no one thought to question. "We need to get the water out of the stores before everything is ruined. Mrs. Gable, you and the other ladies, let us get the children to the church. It is on the highest ground." The women, who had days before been whispering behind her back, now looked to her as their general. They moved with purpose, a small, determined army against the flood. They formed a line, passing buckets not of water to be thrown, but of merchandise to be saved, moving sacks of flour and bolts of cloth from the threatened general store to the safety of a nearby wagon. Delilah stood at the heart of it, directing the effort, her face set with grim determination, her presence a solid, unshakable rock in the swirling chaos. The well was no longer a place of shame. It had become a command post for the salvation of the town. Harlan and his men had been in town preparing for the trial when the storm hit. His first instinct was to ensure the safety of the people. He helped Father Michael get the elderly and the children up the slippery slope to the church, his great strength a bulwark against the sucking current. It was then he heard the scream, a small, high-pitched cry of pure terror. It came from the livery stable, which stood perilously close to the raging creek. The main doors were blocked by a pile of debris the flood had swept against them. A young boy, the stable owner's son, had been caught inside while trying to lead a pony to safety. He was trapped, his small face a white patch of fear in the dark doorway of the hayloft. The water was rising fast, already swirling around the foundation of the stable. Sheriff Pike was there, trying to organize a rescue, but the current was too strong. "It is no use," someone shouted. "The building could go at any minute." Harlan did not hesitate. He grabbed a long coil of rope from a nearby wagon. "Tie this off to the church steeple," he ordered Jeb. He looped the other end around his own waist, securing it with a thick, practical knot. "You are crazy," McGrath the sheriff yelled over the roar of the water. "You will be swept away." Harlan just gave him a single, steady look. "There is a child in there." Before anyone could stop him, he plunged into the churning, muddy water. The cold was a physical shock, the current a living thing that tore and clawed at him, trying to drag him under. He fought it, his powerful legs churning, his arms pulling him through the treacherous water. The rope his only lifeline. He was a force of nature fighting another. Sheriff Pike watched, his face a mask of disbelief and awe, as Harlan swam, not with frantic panic, but with a relentless, focused power. He reached the stable, his hands finding a purchase on the water-slicked wood, and hauled his massive frame out of the flood. He smashed a window, climbed inside, and disappeared from view. A moment later, he reappeared in the hayloft doorway, the small boy held securely in one arm. He tied the rope around the child, and with a shout to the men on the other end, they began to haul the boy to safety. Then, Harlan plunged back into the torrent and fought his way back to the shore. At the other end of town, a different drama was unfolding. Zeke Hollander's saloon was taking on water. The floor a shallow, muddy lake, but Zeke was not helping his neighbors. He was not rescuing children. One of Harlan's ranch hands, Tom, saw him at the back of the saloon, struggling with something heavy. It was his iron cash box. "Mister," Hollander Tom yelled, wrestling with a shutter that was about to be torn from its hinges. "Give me a hand here, the whole wall is about to go." Zeke ignored him, his face a mask of greedy panic. He heaved the iron box onto his shoulder, staggering under its weight. "Every man for himself," he grunted, and splashed his way toward the back door, his only concern the preservation of his wealth. Tom watched him go, disgust plain on his face. He would not forget what he had seen. As suddenly as it had begun, the rain stopped. The water level began to drop, the torrent in the street receding to a muddy river, then a stream, leaving behind a thick, foul-smelling blanket of mud and debris. The town of Dry Creek was a wreck. The bridge was gone. Buildings were damaged. Lives had been upended. But something else had happened. The flood had acted as a kind of judgment. It had washed away the pretense and the posturing, and revealed the true nature of the town's inhabitants. They had seen Delilah, the object of their scorn, become their leader. They had seen Harlan, the quiet, intimidating giant, risk his life for a child without a second thought. And they had seen Zeke Hollander, the smooth-talking power broker, abandon his community to save his money. The water, once a symbol of Delilah's public shaming, had become an agent of cleansing. It left behind a world of mud, but it was an honest mud, a reality that could not be denied. It had washed away the filth of whispers and lies. In the aftermath, as the day's townspeople began to take stock of the damage, people started to come forward. Sarah, the young waitress, found Delilah helping to scrub the mud from the floor of the general store. "I will testify," she said, her voice firm. "I will tell the judge what I know about Zeke." Another woman, whose husband was in debt to the bank, approached Harlan as he helped clear the wreckage of the bridge. "What you did today, Mr. McGrath, that was the act of a good man, my husband and I. We will tell the court how Zeke and the banker threatened us." The tide had turned. The flood had failed to destroy Dry Creek, but it had successfully washed away the foundation of Zeke Hollander's power. The trial was still scheduled for the next day, but it would now be a very different kind of reckoning. The sky above Dry Creek was a raw, clean blue, washed bare by the storm. The air smelled of damp earth and wet pine. There was no courtroom left for Judge Miller to preside over. The roof of the town hall had collapsed. its timbers lying in a heap of muddy splinters. So the trial of Harlan McGrath was convened in the open air, on the high ground in front of the church. A simple wooden table served as the judge's bench, and the entire town stood as jury and audience, their boots sinking slightly into the soft, damp ground. Nature itself was the gallery, the silent mesas and the vast sky the only witnesses that could not be swayed. Judge Miller, a man whose face was a roadmap of whiskey-soaked veins, looked deeply uncomfortable. He was a creature of back rooms and quiet deals. And this public spectacle, with the entire town watching his every move, had stripped him of his usual leverage. He cleared his throat, his gaze flicking nervously from Harlan, who stood solid and silent as a boulder, to Zeke Hollander, whose arm was in a sling and whose face was a pinched mask of fury. Mr. Sterling and Mr. Davies stood near Zeke, but they kept a careful distance, their city clothes looking absurdly out of place in the muddy churchyard. The proceedings began. A thin veneer of legal formality laid over the raw emotion of the town. Zeke's lawyer, a slick man from the county seat, called witnesses who spoke of Harlan's size and temper, painting a picture of a violent brute who had brutally assaulted an upstanding citizen. But the words felt hollow in the open air, their power diminished by the memory of the flood that was still fresh in everyone's mind. Then it was Harlan's turn. He did not have a lawyer. He had only the truth. He called his first witness. "I call Mrs. Gable," he said, his voice a low rumble that carried easily in the quiet. The elderly woman walked forward, her back straight, her steps steady. She told the judge what she had seen at the fair, her account clear and unadorned. And then she told him of the men who had threatened her on the church steps, her voice ringing with indignation. Next came Tom, the ranch hand. He described Zeke's frantic efforts to save his cash box while the town was in peril, his words painting a damning portrait of greed and cowardice. Then Sheriff Pike was called. He took a long look at the pages Delilah had given him, the ones she had taken from Zeke's ledger. He had shown them to Harlan the night before, a silent confirmation that he would stand on the side of justice. "Not just order, Your Honor," the sheriff said, holding up the papers. "These were recovered from Mr. Hollander's saloon. They appear to be pages from his business ledger. They contain some interesting notations." He read them aloud. Sweetener for Judge M. A collective gasp went through the crowd. Judge Miller's face went from ruddy to a pasty white. He looked as if he had been struck. The sheriff continued, reading the notes about land surveys and railroad deals, each entry another nail in Zeke's coffin. Sarah, the waitress, was called next. She trembled, but her voice was firm as she confirmed that the handwriting was Zeke's, and that she had seen him make such notes many times. Finally, Harlan turned, his gaze finding Delilah in the crowd. "I call Delilah Whitlock," he said. A path opened for her. She walked to the front, her posture erect, her eyes clear. She did not look at Harlan, or at Zeke, but at the judge and the town. She stood there for a long moment, letting the silence settle, gathering her strength. And then she spoke, her voice not loud, but so clear and steady that every single person strained to hear it. "My name is Delilah Rose Whitlock. I came to this territory to start a new life. I took a job as a cook for Mr. McGrath. I have done my work faithfully and honestly for weeks. My name has been dragged through the mud of this town, turned into a dirty joke by that man," she said, gesturing toward Zeke. "He spread lies. He sent a man to my window in the night to terrorize me. He tried to burn down the kitchen where I work, and when all that failed, he struck me in front of you all because I would not bow to his insults." She paused, taking a deep breath, her gaze sweeping over the faces of the women in the crowd, the ones she had worked alongside during the flood. "I am not here to ask for your pity. I am not a victim asking for rescue. I am a woman who has been wronged, and I am here to demand my dignity. My name is my own. My work is my own. My honor is my own, and none of you, especially not him, has the right to take that away from me." A profound silence followed her words. It was the silence of a truth so plain and powerful it left no room for argument. Zeke Hollander, his face purple with rage, saw his entire world crumbling around him. The judge was staring at him with cold fury. His friends from the bank and railroad were inching away, and the townspeople were looking at him with open contempt, in a final, desperate act of mindless violence. He lunged. He did not lunge at Harlan, but at Delilah, his good hand clawing for a knife tucked into his boot. He never reached her. Harlan moved with a speed that was terrifying in a man his size. He intercepted Zeke, not with a fist, but with an open hand that caught Zeke's wrist in an iron grip. There was no struggle. There was no brawl. Harlan simply stood there, holding the snarling, struggling man as easily as a man might hold a trapped rabbit. Zeke's struggles were useless against the bigger man's immovable strength. Harlan held him, his face calm, his eyes cold, until Sheriff Pike stepped forward and snapped a pair of handcuffs onto Zeke's one good wrist. Judge Miller, his face a grim mask, stood up. His voice, when he spoke, was cold and hard. He was a man fighting for his own reputation now. "Zeke Hollander, you are under arrest for assault, intimidation of a witness, and conspiracy. You will be held in the county jail pending a full investigation into the matters brought to light by this ledger. The charges against Harlan McGrath are dismissed." He banged a rock he was using as a gavel on the table. "This court is adjourned." As the sheriff led Zeke away, Mr. Sterling and Mr. Davies faded into the crowd, their quiet, hurried departure a confession in itself. Harlan's ranch was safe. For a long moment, the townspeople stood in silence, the weight of the morning's events settling upon them. Then, from the back of the crowd, a single person began to clap. It was Sarah, the waitress, then Mrs. Gable joined in. Soon, another person, and then another. The sound grew, a slow, rolling wave of applause that filled the churchyard. They were not clapping for the violence they had seen. They were clapping for the quiet courage of a woman who had demanded her own name back, and for the profound, controlled strength of a man who had finally won a fight not with his fists, but with his stillness. The dawn that followed the trial was not a fiery spectacle, but a quiet, gentle thing. It crept over the mesas and touched the muddy, wounded town with a soft, forgiving light. The work began almost immediately, born not of any formal decree, but of a shared, unspoken understanding. The flood and the trial had broken Dry Creek, but they had also broken it open, exposing a foundation of decency that had long been buried under fear and suspicion. Harlan's ranch hands rode into town not for supplies, but with hammers and saws. They worked alongside the town blacksmith and the general store owner, their combined rhythms of sawing and hammering a new kind of music for the town. They started with the roof of the town hall, their figures dark against the morning sky as they cleared the debris, and began the slow, arduous task of mending what had been broken. Delilah did not return to the ranch. Instead, she claimed the one place that was now hers by right of courage, the space beside the town well. With the help of Mrs. Gable and Sarah, she built a fire and set her largest soup pot over it. She requisitioned potatoes and onions from the general store's salvaged goods, and Harlan sent a boy back to the ranch for a side of smoked bacon. Soon, the rich, comforting scent of simmering soup filled the air, a promise of warmth and sustenance. She became the heart of the recovery, ladling soup into bowls for anyone who was hungry, her presence a steady, calming force. People who had once crossed the street to avoid her now came to her for a cup of soup and a quiet word, their eyes meeting hers with a newfound respect that was more nourishing than any food. Harlan worked all day, his great strength a tireless engine of reconstruction. He lifted beams that 3 other men could not budge, his silence no longer a thing to be misinterpreted as slowness, but understood as a deep, focused strength. He and Delilah did not speak much during the day. There was no need. A shared look across the busy square, a nod of acknowledgement, was enough. They were two poles of the same new world, each doing the work that was theirs to do. By late afternoon, Sheriff Ransom Pike came by, his badge no longer seeming like a symbol of compromise, but of a hard-won peace. He accepted a bowl of soup from Delilah and watched Harlan hefting a new support beam for the livery stable. The banker and the railroad man left on the morning stage. The sheriff said, his voice dry, "They seem to have lost their interest in our town's future, and Judge Miller found it in his heart to set Zeke Hollander's bail so high he will be enjoying county hospitality for a very long time." He took a sip of the soup and let out a satisfied sigh. The thirsty gulch is boarded up. It is quieter now. He looked over at the well, where a group of children were laughing as they helped wash mud from buckets. And there is more laughter near the well. All in all, a fair trade. Father Michael approached them later, his face tired but his eyes bright. "Delilah," he said, "what you have done here, you have fed this town's body and its spirit. With the saloon closed, there is a need for a place where people can gather. A decent place, an eatery, perhaps, a small boarding house for travelers." Delilah looked down at her hands, stained from soot and cooking. "I am just a cook, Father." "You are a cornerstone," he corrected her gently. Harlan walked over. Having heard the exchange, he stood beside Delilah, his presence a silent affirmation. "We have timber at the ranch," he said, looking at the priest but speaking to Delilah. "Good, seasoned pine. And my men are good builders. If a place like that were to be built, we would have the materials." It was not a question. It was a statement, a promise of a shared future, built of solid wood and mutual respect. Delilah looked up at him, and in her eyes, he saw not the guarded woman he had hired months ago, but a partner. "Yes," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "I think that would be a very good thing." The light had long faded by the time the work stopped for the day. A deep, weary peace settled over the town. One by one, the lights in the houses winked out, until only one remained, the soft, yellow glow of the oil lamp on the porch of the cookhouse back at the ranch, where Delilah and Harlan had finally returned. They sat on the porch steps, the silence between them comfortable, familiar. The night was cool, and the air carried the clean, distant smell of rain. A faint purple bruise was visible on Harlan's cheekbone, a souvenir from a falling timber he had pushed a young boy out of the way of. Delilah reached out, her fingers gently tracing the edge of the bruise. Her touch was feather-light, a question and a comfort all at once. He did not flinch or pull away. Instead, he slowly raised his own hand and laid it over hers, his large, warm palm completely covering the back of her hand. His skin was calloused and rough from work, but his touch was incredibly gentle. He said nothing. She said nothing. All the words that needed to be said had been spoken in the daylight, in front of the whole town. This moment was for the things that had no words. It was for the quiet understanding that had grown between them, a hardy plant in a harsh and unforgiving land. He looked at her, and in his eyes she saw the end of her long, lonely road. She saw home. She leaned into him, and his arm came around her, drawing her close. It was not a desperate, frantic embrace, but a slow, solid coming together. It was an anchor in the storm, a promise of shelter, a quiet vow that held more weight than 1,000 flowery speeches. She rested her head against his chest, feeling the slow, steady beat of his heart. And for the first time since the wagon accident that had shattered her world, she felt completely and utterly safe. The next morning, they stood together and watched the sun rise. The last of the storm clouds had vanished. The horizon was clean and sharp. The ground was not yet free of mud. The scars of the flood and the fire were still visible, but the air was finally clear of lies. They were not two separate people anymore, a lonely rancher and a solitary cook. They were a beginning. As the first rays of sun touched the world, turning the dust to gold, the small lamp she had left burning on the porch all night finally flickered out. Its job done. From a distance, it had looked like a star that had come down to Earth, a small but steady beacon showing the way home. Thank you for listening to our story. Please comment where you are listening from so we can all connect, and do not forget to subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like the video, and press the hype button to help this story reach more listeners.